Hello and welcome to Inclusive Spaces seminar series at the Bartlett, the faculty's built environment here at UCL. I'm Sarah Shaffi, Vice Dean of EDI, and I will be hosting this session. Inclusive Spaces is a monthly online series event led by the Bartlett's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Group, where we explored disability, race, gender, LGBTQI+, and many other dimensions of diversity, and discover how they intersect with the built environments around the world. Today, you've joined the October edition of Inclusive Spaces, Decolonial and Restorative Policy. But before we begin, I'm going to have to do a bit of housekeeping. Today's Inclusive Spaces panel discussion will be captioned by a live professional human captioner. If you wish to view the captions on a separate browser, please click on the link at the bottom of the chat. If you have any issues accessing the captions, please contact us via the Q&A function. The event is also being recorded, and the recording and transcript will be added to the Bartlett's YouTube channel and forwarded to the registered attendees after the event. In terms of the format for the session, we're going to welcome our guests to present for the first half of the session, and that's going to be followed by a Q&A at the end. And we're going to have to promptly finish by 2 p.m. We really do encourage you to submit questions for the speakers at any point during the lectures by clicking on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to cover as many of those questions as we can at the end of the session. So today, it's my pleasure to welcome Naili Kalima, PhD student at the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose, as well as Felicity Atek, Associate Professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture. Together, we're going to explore the importance of decolonial, intersectional, anti-racist, and other social justice theoretical frameworks for policymakers and governments dealing with racial inequality and other societal inequalities in digital technologies and AI. We're also going to explore Restorative Futures, which champions change by addressing emerging trends and challenges and evolving landscapes within and across built environment policy. So, without further ado, I'm going to welcome Naili Kalima to share her presentation on decolonizing digital transformation and policy with us. Nai, it's over to you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. And I would like to also thank everyone who is here today. I'm really glad to spend this time together and in celebration of Black History Month. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, let's do that. And let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so a little bit about me. My name is Naili Kalima. I'm a PhD student in Innovation and Public Policy at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And my research is supervised by Professor Rainer Cattell and Associate Professor Kate Roll. And for my research, I look a lot at global digital policy and public sector digital transformation. And so really trying to think about this kind of global political economy of digital transformation. Okay, next slide. So I think a good place to begin is to, when I talk about colonialism and the legacies of colonialism, which are coloniality, I really like to explore them as processes of both material and immaterial violence, and that structure power and systems. And so today we're going to look at how does this come up around digital transformation, and also thinking about what does this mean for space. So thinking about as we move through society and as we move through the world. And in terms of really thinking about coloniality, really thinking about it in relationship. So these colonial legacies and logics in relationship to contemporary inequalities and injustices that are going on across the world today. And so thinking about it in relationship to questions around different types of classism or racism or patriarchy or homophobia or transphobia or poverty, hunger and inequality, thinking about how do these things relate. And so in terms of through my work, and as we'll talk more about some of these things today, is I look at colonial violence in relationship to, different types of epistemic violence or the normalization of violence in relationship to certain bodies, so everyday violence, necropolitical violence. And so thinking about how do state systems or state policies, how can they enact different types of violence in a structural manner. And then also in terms of thinking about, the psychological and the physical violence that comes with this colonial domination. And there are many different ways of looking at colonial domination. There are different expressions of it. So I'm really interested in thinking about, how is this being expressed around digital transformation in AI. In terms of coloniality, one of the conceptual tools that I use to try and dig deeper into this area is something called the colonial matrix of power. And so this was a concept that was developed by Anibal Quijano, who was a scholar from Latin America. And it's really thinking about coloniality across several dimensions. And so thinking about it in relationship to power, and so states and things like this, coloniality of being, and so in terms of the self, coloniality of knowledge, so in terms of how it expresses itself across epistemic processes and also knowledge production, and then coloniality with respect to gender and sexuality. And so there are different ways in which coloniality intersects around power. And in terms of a thinker who really informs kind of my work is Eugene Richardson. So he is a physician anthropologist based at the Harvard Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, who says that coloniality conceptually looks at the racial, political, economic, social, epistemological, linguistic, and gendered hierarchical orders imposed by European colonialism that have transcended decolonization and that continue to oppress in accordance with the needs of pan-capital. And so I think what's really interesting about this framing is he's connecting this idea of coloniality and colonial domination to global political and economic systems and the capitalist system as well, and seeing these things as being inextricably linked. And so this very much informs kind of the framing. In terms of now, another big area to think about would be digital transformation. And so coloniality is kind of maybe this lens, this theoretical lens and political lens that I bring to the work. And digital transformation is the context in which I explore it. And so in terms of an area that really animated my thinking is this quote from Achille Mbembe out of his, I think his most recent book, or one of his recent books called Out of the Dark Night, Essays on Decolonization. And in that, he has this quote where he says, in a global culture in which the footprints of social life are increasingly digitized, software is becoming the engine of society, and algorithmic reasoning, a new form of thinking, to a large extent, software is remaking the human. New ways of theorizing, measurement, and quantification are more than ever required if we are to account for the ongoing computational reconfigurations of subjectivity and of the social. And so it was really kind of these words which really kind of framed my thinking and want to do research in this area. In terms of digital transformation, I know this is a pretty broad term. In terms of how I choose to explore it in my research and in my work, is I think about digital transformation as a collective process. So as a collective process of structural, societal, organizational, and relational change through processes of datafication. So datafication being translating activities and behaviors into data. Digitization, which is transforming actions or proxy data into digitally formatted and computationally recognizable information. And digitalization, which is the reorganization of social life through digital technologies and data. And so this definition is really kind of how I frame it, looking at these interrelated processes to understand how our digital technologies and data, maybe data-centric ways of making change, how is this really changing society and our relationship with one another? So in terms of digital transformation, the context in which I look at it is primarily in the context of the public sector. And so specifically my research, I look at particularly the area around digital public infrastructure, and I look at digital identity because digital identity is one of the core digital public infrastructures, which is really reshaping the relationship between states and its populace. And it's mediating that in really interesting ways that I think should be studied. And so this is the area that I focus on. But of course, in terms of understanding digital transformation across governments, there are many different things around policies and regulations and rights that are relevant. I mentioned one of the core digital public infrastructures. So there's also digital payments and data exchanges, in addition to digital identity systems that are really creating kind of the platformization of governments, is sometimes how scholars talk about it. And it's really changing a lot of how different types of public services and public systems work. And so collectively, I kind of think that in relationship to this public administration paradigm known as digital era governments. In terms of this idea of exploring the dark matter, and so this dark matter concept comes from Dan Heal, who was formerly a professor at UCL at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, but he's now at the University of Melbourne, I believe, as dean of their school. But he talks about this idea of the dark matter being the ways that we can perceive by implication, and it being a metaphor for trying to dig deeper into the relationship between organizations, culture, and systems. And so I think this is a really good conceptual tool to use alongside decolonial thought to begin to interrogate what is happening and deepening our understanding of it. So now to the kind of the meat and potatoes, this idea of the coloniality of digital transformation. What do I mean when I talk about that? So we're going to explore some examples and we'll talk more about that. And so in terms of this idea of looking at coloniality in AI and in digital systems, there's this concept called the coded gaze, which came from Dr. Joy Buolamwini, who is a data scientist and an activist around different types of data justice. And her concept of the coded gaze explores how different types of biases and get encoded into algorithmic systems, whether intentional or not, and how that can affect harmful outcomes. And so she looks at that in relationship to thinking about who's designing these systems, whose priorities are given preferential treatment across these systems, and the choices that are made about how they will be run. And she extends this to kind of think about seeing algorithmic bias as something that's connected to different types of discrimination and harm that's going on today. And so she looks at that in relationship to technical systems. And I think it's a really good framework that informs my work in terms of the coloniality in AI. And so basically, the person on the screen is, I don't know if you can see it. Let me press play. Let's see.
So this paper was about the potential risks and harms of large language models. There's a lot of hype and there is a lot of resources that's going towards developing these large language models. And they can be embedded in many different applications related to language. So whether it's machine translation, completing your sentences or something, trying to predict the next word that you're going to say, or one of them is even used in search.
Does Google specifically use this technology?
They use one of them, yeah. The funny thing is that we weren't talking about Google specific technologies, right? We were talking about a specific type of technology that is used by literally all companies. We cited so many papers: Facebook, Google, OpenAI, Microsoft. These large language models have generated a lot of hype, a lot of press, but a lot of the dialogue around them is literally dominated by people in privileged groups. Even when people talk about the potential risks and harms, the people you see out there talking about them and being listened to are people from privileged groups. So we wanted to write a paper about what we view as the risks and harms, not from that perspective.
Okay, so in the video that was briefly shared, you heard some words from Dr. Timnit Gebru. She's one of the world's leading AI ethicists, and in 2020, she was fired from Google for a research paper that she co-wrote, which was looking at issues of multiple forms of discrimination being present within large language models, and talking about how, this could lead to other types of harms, and really wanting to make the company aware of it. The research paper that I recommend all of you check out, I've included a screenshot of that in the corner and a brief excerpt from that. But basically, what was interesting is when she brought this to the attention of her company, instead of dealing with these harms, instead of addressing it, effectively she was fired. And I think this points out how, when people think about different types of bias emerging around AI, I think it's oftentimes it's promoted, or it's not promoted, but it's presented as if it's a glitch, an error, or a mistake. But sometimes even when people are in a position to be informed of what is going on, there are structural power issues that can still keep that from happening. And so I think this was a really interesting case to kind of highlight how coloniality in AI, how deep it really runs. And today, Timnet has started her own AI group, which focuses on AI ethics called DARE. And so we'll come back to that later.
So this paper was...
No, I don't want to do that. And so after this incident, this happened probably, I think, last summer, if I'm not mistaken. And so basically with this one, this is a person named George Hinton, and he is one of the people who he's known as the AI godfather. And so a voice that is really well respected and listened to in the field of AI. And formerly he was at Google, but he had left Google. And upon leaving Google, really put out this call talking about the dangers of AI and talking about there was a need for world leaders to get together to try and change that. And so I'll play that very briefly. So just a few seconds.
There have been some whistleblowers who have been warning about the dangers of AI over the past few years. One of them, Timnit Gebru, was forced out of Google for voicing his concerns. Looking back on it, do you wish that you had stood behind these whistleblowers more?
Timnit's actually a woman.
Oh, sorry.
So they were rather different concerns from mine. I think it's easier to voice concerns if you leave the company first. And their concerns aren't as existentially serious as the idea of these things getting more intelligent than us and taking over.
Steve, what?
Okay, so I highlight this clip because there's a few interesting things at play. One, the harms that Timnit talked about occurring around how these LLMs or large language models were being used by the systems was talking about how it was at risk of multiplying discriminations against marginalized people. Saying that, the systems were, racist, misogynistic, ageist, etc. And his views, these types of discriminatory views were overrepresented in the training data that it was using to set up its models. And so it would amplify biases and harm. What's interesting here is I think that hearing the words of this, of Mr. Hinton himself, Dr. Hinton himself, is that when it's brought up that, hey, you had somebody bring up, concerns of this nature, he really tries to distinguish to say that the concerns that were brought up by Timnit were not as existential as the types of concerns that he came up with. But I think that Meredith Whittaker, she really points out something that should be noted, that she says, I think it's Meredith Whittaker, president of Signal, responded that I think it's stunning that someone would say that the harms from AI that are happening now, which are being felt most acutely by people who have been historically minoritized, Black people, women, disabled people, precarious workers, etc., that those harms are not as existential. And so I think that one of the things that this highlights is in terms of whose voices get valued or devalued around these conversations, and in terms of whose existence matters, being something that is worth exploring and critiquing, because I think Hinton's comments seem to suggest that the hypothetical harms that he's talking about that could result from AI was more important and more worthy of being recognized and being dealt with than the actual harms being experienced by minoritized, racialized, and marginalized people today. And so I think this again speaks to how the coloniality of AI, it's not only in the tech, but it's also in terms of what's happening around the tech. let's go to the
There have been
next
some
slide.
whistle.
Okay, and so in terms of some of the concerns raised by Timnit, she was right. Recently, this was a research paper that came out in Nature, and this was based on a piece that came out a few days ago, talking about how a bombshell study from Stanford found that ChatGPT, which is an example of the type of technology relevant to what Gebru was talking about, how ChatGPT it was giving out information using logics from like race-based medicine, which has long been debunked, and giving out information that could be harmful, particularly for Black patients. And so this was an example of how this large language model, the biases within that, were propagating race-based medicine, which could lead to harmful effects, particularly for Black patients. And that's a great paper to read if you like. In terms of thinking about, why is this happening? Why is it that, it's not only a lack of awareness or foreseeability, but these things are kind of this reoccurrent problem showing up around many different areas of AI and digital transformation. And so Meredith Broussard, she wrote a book called More Than a Glitch, Confronting Race, Gender, Ability, and Bias in Tech. And she explains that digital technology is wonderful and world-changing, and it's also racist, sexist, and ableist. And for many years, we have focused on the positives about technology, pretending that the problems are only glitches. The biases embedded in technology are more than glitches. They are structural biases, and they can only be addressed. They can't be addressed with a quick code update. It's time to think to address the issues head on, unflinchingly. And taking advantage of everything we know about culture and how biases of the real world take shape inside our computational systems. And so this is a great book to look at, but I think this is beginning to think about some of these issues going on around digital transformation and AI. They're not just glitches. We should interrogate that more. And so her book is a fantastic read. I recommend it. In terms of just a really interesting quote, this comes from Selbst, who talks about to treat fairness and justice as terms that have meaningful applications to technology as separate from a social context is an abstraction era. And so some of what is happening today is an abstraction era that needs to be corrected. And I think decolonial and restorative concepts and framings, they can help to fill that gap and help to change that. In terms of examples of coloniality showing up in public systems, in coloniality around digital transformation in particular, there's a concept called the New Jim Code from Ruha Benjamin. And so she is a great scholar who really looks at this issue and thinks about how do discriminatory design get encoded into digital systems. And in the first example, the first image, this is an image from a great paper that was prepared by Timnit Gebru and then Joy Bulamwini, whose work I've talked about earlier, looking at kind of how systems can affect different types of intersectional harms. And so the items in green show that, the facial recognition software for these three companies, it was fairly recognizable and had a high level of accuracy. However, when looking particularly at Black women, it was quite low. In this second example here, this is an article from a case where a lady was incorrectly identified by facial recognition software and arrested. And this was for a case that I think was dealing with some sort of shoplifting or some sort of theft. And she was 8 months pregnant at the time, but she was still arrested and had to contest it. And she talked about that experience and kind of how harmful it had been for her and her unborn child at the time. And then this third image is from an article that recently came out talking about facial recognition softwares, how it was having problems, not only recognizing people who were more melanated, but people who had yellow undertones in their skin. And so in terms of, facial recognition, this is an example of how, whether it's because, the designers didn't have people of color in mind, or because of how these systems are being used and implemented in society, it's affecting different types of bias that can turn into harm. In terms of what does this mean in terms of what we see today in the UK? So there was an incident where the UK launched a passport photo checker that was having a hard time recognizing people with darker skin. That report came out in 2019. However, up to 2021, even after the government was made aware of its racially biased passport checker and its failures to recognize Black people. Even though an update had been available for more than a year, they had failed to implement it. And so this is where I think we begin to think about not only is there problems around design and implementation, but even the reluctance to fix some of the problems when they become apparent being there. This is an image of a van. I don't know if you've seen this before, but sometimes you see these vans around, and basically up here, there are cameras. And what these cameras do is they're used for facial recognition. And a lot of the times these are being put in public spaces. And so police and private companies in the UK are increasingly using facial recognition technology to monitor, categorize, and track people. And there are a whole host of problems around how inaccurate this system is, but also how it can be used to facilitate other types of harms, particularly against racialized people and more melanated people. And this is a really, really big issue. I'll move on for sake of time, just so we can get through everything. In terms of not only is this facial recognition technology at issue and it being used widely in public spaces, oftentimes without people's knowledge, is that in terms of the areas that get targeted for the training and use of these technologies, it has been used in ways where it's leading to the hypersurveillance of minoritized and Black people. And so in this first instance, this was looking at how they were training the data and using this software at the Notting Hill Carnival in 2017. The one in the middle is an example of how recently they were using this technology in Wales at the Beyonce concert. And as a Beyonce fan, I was pretty shocked to learn this. And then recently, it was also used around the coronation of King Charles. And in terms of how these facial recognition tools get used, they're used oftentimes for the hypersurveillance of very specific bodies. And so in terms of political activists, racialized people, it's put in areas that kind of help to lead to the hypersurveillance of specific populations. And this can have harmful effects. Also, I should mention that it's being used in many other different areas. So not just in terms of public space, but also in schools, in many different areas. Yeah. In terms of one of the recent things that have happened is due to the cost of living crisis, the Met Police recently, have been putting out reports talking about, they need to do something about the shoplifting pandemic or epidemic. And then recently it was announced in July 2023 that the government had signed with IBM a $69.8 million or 54.7 million pound contract with the British government to develop a national biometrics platform to offer more facial recognition functionality for immigration and law enforcement purposes. And so I thought it was really interesting to kind of look at in terms of not only thinking about, what can digital transformation really offer, but thinking about where you have a choice, where you have a cost of living crisis and you have a choice to deal with the root causes of a problem, but you choose to take this more technocratic approach, perhaps ignoring what are the root causes for the problem in the beginning, it's perhaps the wrong move. And why I say that is if you look in the upper right-hand corner, these are a few images just talking about how in terms of this cost of living crisis, the price of food prices have gone up about 12.9% in a relatively short time span, and also people's housing insecurity. And so these are the root causes of what we might be seeing, and where you can address those root causes or create a digital system that can deal with perhaps the implications of those root causes, one really has to wonder if this is the right approach. So also another area worth briefly mentioning is in the UK, they had something called the Met's Gang Violence Matrix. It's a database of people designated or suspected of being gang associated. From 2018 to 2021, 88% of the people in that database are Black and or minority ethnic. And 96% of the people in that database are male. In 2021, the gang violence matrix disproportionately comprised itself of Black people, Black male people, even through the under 25. So this is for ages under 25 years of age population in London, even though the population of people that were Black and male in that population were around 22%. 72% of the people in that database, 76% actually of the people in that grouping in the database were Black. And so one really has to wonder what's going on. Why is this the case? So one of the interesting things that came up when I was looking into this is that in terms of what could get you put into that database, it could range from people's what music you listen to. So if you share drill or grime music over social media, that was one of the factors that were cited. Or if you were knew someone who was on the list, or if you had been victimized of a crime yourself. And so even, you know, the problem is by being in this database, even if you didn't do anything, you haven't been convicted of any crime, nothing, you've done nothing, it could still lead to people being excluded from different types of public services, and in some cases could be used against people around immigration. And so it had really, really harmful implications for people. People had no ability to contest, they weren't given notice about it, and it was disproportionately targeted towards Black people. And so I think this is an example of how, you know, this digital transformation data and these things, how it could be used in ways which are really anti-democratic. In terms of health and the health system, I think Javid, so health secretary in the UK, put out, there was a news article where he was talking about how medical devices may have led to avoidable UK COVID deaths. And so there were just basically algorithmic bias in different types of medical technology that was used to help guide decision makings around care. And so whether you'd be triaged for care or whether you'd be asked hospitalized or not, and because of these systemic biases within the technology, it led to avoidable deaths. And this is compounded when, you know, you look at figures like Black people being 4 times more likely to die of COVID than white people in the UK. And so it's just kind of exacerbation of harm that's going on. And I think another really timely case of how this is happening is around maternal and neonatal health. And so already in the UK, Black women are almost, I think, 4 times as likely to die. And Asian women are about almost 2 times as likely to die during pregnancy, childbirth. In terms of the amplification of the harm, the NHS announced recently that it had intended to have the NHS begin including, I guess, their home office reference number for people who are migrants in the UK on their medical information, so that it could help them to keep track of, as they said, who to bill. But it's led to an exacerbation of harm. And so, for instance, this is a recent report talking about migrant women in the UK who are sometimes charged and incorrectly charged for seeking maternity health services. And so this is leading to what some have called this kind of hostile environment being formed. And also in terms of who is targeted around these changes. And in terms of this idea of linking these kind of different types of data together, that being a choice that's not necessarily motivated to offer better care, but motivated because of political motivations. And so I thought this was an example of how coloniality in digital transformation can exacerbate existing harms. And then I think the last one that I'll mention briefly is this idea of digital apartheids. And so how are digital systems being used to racially target, surveillance, and segregate populations of people? And in terms of looking at different reports of race-based digital apartheid systems or automated apartheid systems, there have been examples reported of this in the Xinjiang region of China, also in South Africa. This report came from MIT Tech, I believe, in 2022, and then also in other parts of the world, that it highlights that there is this issue around this kind of racializing approach that can occur around how these technologies are used that I think is even relevant to what we see going on in the UK today. And so I conceptually explore that through what I call digital racial capitalism. I have a paper about it, check it out, but we're going to move on for sake of time. So coloniality, it's embedded in policy. It's these logics of difference, who cares, who matters, whose existence is prioritized, in terms of public policies that fail to rebalance extreme inequity and power asymmetries, and then in fact can amplify existing harms. This is another issue. And then public policies that create, maintain, or amplify colonial logics. These are some of the issues that I see coming up around as coloniality in policy related to digital transformation. And so what does it mean to decolonize digital transformation? This quote or this idea comes from a person named Robbie Shillham. And so he wrote a really great book called Decolonizing Politics, an Introduction. And he talks about it, decolonizing politics involving looking at the imperial centers and the colonial margins alongside its logics used to divide them into such, and doing so with marginalized perspectives. And so in terms of how I interpret that, before I get to that, and I think it's a useful framing so that we can begin to kind of reorient how we interrogate these areas and look at digital transformation, not as this apolitical process, but as something that's deeply political and tied to different types of ideologies and logics. And then this quote comes from Cattell and Mergel, which talks about economic efficiency gains are not enough as value frameworks for digital transformation. Digital agendas must be comprehensive and focused and combine social justice and other pressing socio-political issues with economic efficiency. And so really putting the onus on digital transformation is not just about efficiency, it's about making a more just world and dealing with the socio-political issues that came before it and that emerged through it. So for me, decolonizing digital transformation is not just about reformation, but really ensuring that such transformations are pursued through political praxis, and that they also must be in service of liberation, self-determination, equity, and well-being, human and planetary, for all. Reveal the concealed, so revealing what is hidden, addressing root causes, focusing on the redistribution and reorganization of power along these processes, I think is key. And then also co-creating, reimagining through solidarity, collaboration, and activism, more just futures. And so I think I'm running short on time. So I'll just kind of go fast. There are 3 examples that I'll briefly mention. I'm happy to share more afterwards. But in terms of diminishing the coded gaze, so this comes from Joy Bloom-Weenie's work. She talks about increasing traceability and transparency of AI systems, inclusive by design datasets, intentional investigations of exclusionary experiences, institutional accountability, collaboration, co-creative, equity-centered engagements. This is David Monina Senge. So he's the Minister of Education and Chief Innovation Officer in Sierra Leone. And so he came up with this idea of radical inclusion policy. And he really explored this around digital transformation in the educational sector in Sierra Leone, coming up with this idea of really focusing on reaching the margins, not just the center. And he has some really great principles around that in his book that you can check out. And then also in terms of intersectionally based policy analysis. And so thinking about intersectionality is something very, very core to Black feminist scholarship. So intersectionality as it's explored by Crenshaw, and even in relationship to this matrix of domination from Patricia Hill Collins, but thinking about how can you address the root causes of discrimination and look at the way that it might intersect around specific experiences. And so really adding this layer of analysis to digital transformation. This is an image of some women doing amazing work that I want to highlight for Black History Month. Please check out this piece. It's from the Rolling Stones, and it has a lot of the people here that are highlighted, people that I refer to in this work and that were part of this presentation today. And in terms of how to get involved, so I'm involved in Terra Commune. I also am joined up on the mailing list primarily for Data for Black Lives and the Algorithmic Justice League, and I'm a part of the ESCR Digital Good Network. And so there are a lot of really great groups doing fantastic work you should reach out to and learn more. And then this is a bonus, a gift for Black History Month. This is an image of some of the amazing work that I referred to in this presentation today, and that I really encourage you all, take a screenshot, check it out yourselves. There's a lot of good stuff. And in closing, decolonial approaches to digital transformation can be harnessed to create more inclusive spaces across diverse societies, creating more equitable spaces, inclusive experiences, and just futures. And so that is all. Thank you very much for your time.
Nai, thank you so much for that incredible presentation and sharing your incredible research and insights. I'm sure everyone has found it absolutely amazing and resonates with so many people. I'm aware that we're well over time, and we really do want to fit Felicity's presentation in. We did have an interactive segment that has some questions we wanted to pose to all of you, but I'm going to put those in the chat for you, something to take away. And I'm also conscious we may not have time for a Q&A section at the end. So what we'll try to do is answer the questions in the chat for you in the Q&A function. Now you'll see some have popped up already for you, and there's some brilliant ones that I think really should be answered. But I'm going to pass over to Felicity, who is going to share her presentation with us. Felicity, over to you. You're muted, Felicity, still.
Thank you, everyone. I will try and be as quick as I can. Next slide, please. I wanted to start with this quote by Dr. Paul Farmer, a medical anthropologist and physician who sadly died last year. The idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that is wrong with the world, and I really do believe this. Discrimination is harmful not only to individuals and groups of people, but also to whole societies, and contributes ultimately to lasting suffering for all. In the few minutes I have, I want to propose an alternative, restorative way of looking at public policy as it relates to race and its social inequalities. To echo the words of Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, leaders should be role models with stature and principles. They should value constructive messages because words matter. When they start creating divisiveness, it gives liberty to others to do worse and damages the fabric of society. For me, as a Black woman, practitioner and academic, the fact that Barack Obama was succeeded by Donald Trump weighs heavily. But the UK is not so different. In all relevant statistics, it is a dangerous business living in Britain today if you're not white, middle class, and educated. This fact is what motivates my desire for change. Next slide, please. The UK's political landscape since the Second World War has leaned towards caring and welfare policies and the rights of all, regardless of race and other social constructs. However, these rights have been eroded by successive governments. Good policies exist, but are all too often implemented in a tokenistic way, and diversity is conflated with representation. But race, I think, is a social construct and a social policy issue and should be treated as such. Policies are important because they set out a society's approach, attitudes, and values. At the heart of what people want is, if not the right to be treated equally, then at least to be provided with an equality of opportunity enshrined in law. We need a new restorative approach to public policy in the UK that addresses issues related to race, discrimination, and inequality. Let us be clear, good, equitable policies on race, like all equitable policies, work for everyone. How we treat others and the othered directly reflects our level of compassion and care as a civil society. Achieving this is one of the great challenges of our time, particularly when nationalism is on the rise throughout the world and rights are being eroded. Next slide, please. However, nobody likes to be criticized. Working together requires new ways of understanding, sympathizing, and empathizing. This demands us to be honest, not only with others, but also with ourselves. This self-reflective process extends to acknowledging the inequalities and atrocities of the past so that we can lay the foundations for restorative futures. A restorative approach advocates a proactive rather than a reactive response to public policy in a rapidly changing world, allowing us to be more effectively addressing issues related to health, human rights, climate, urbanism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in a resource-poor setting, both locally and globally. Restorative practices introduce a way of working with conflict that puts the focus on repairing and mending harm that has been done. It is an approach to conflict resolution that includes all the parties involved. In the little time I have today, I will describe restorative futures as I see it in relation to their intersections with race in 5 key sectors: crime and policing, education and training, employment, fairness at work and enterprise, health, places and spaces. Next slide, please. We all need respectful policing policies that build trust and governance, supporting justice and rights and advancing social protection. One of the greatest successes of recent policy is restorative justice, which acknowledges the place of feelings and the impact on victims of crimes and injustices. This approach was made popular by the Truth and Reconciliation Committees of post-apartheid South Africa in 2003. However, it is not mandatory. Restorative justice is a process whereby parties with a stake in a specific offense collectively resolve how to deal with the aftermath of the offense and its implications for the future. Next slide, please. In education and training, the government's own statistics in the UK show that discrimination is still a concern for attainment rates in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. Change can only come through addressing vertical and horizontal inequalities, in my opinion. And according to Paul Spicker, Emeritus Professor of Public Policy at the Robert Gordon University, Aberdeen, education has a particularly significant place as an instrument of social policy, not only for social welfare policies, but also for policies aimed at societal structures. Janet Fitch, in the Education as Social Policy, argues that education provides a convenient basis for policy for children because of its universal coverage and because it is easy to justify welfare means in educational terms. In Scotland, for example, restorative approaches in primary and secondary education are built on values which separate the person from the behavior. They promote accountability and seek to repair any harm caused in a situation. I am particularly interested in collaborating on a new schedule to the Education Act of 2011 in the same way that Schedule 12 deals with apprentices. Next slide. One of the most impressive pieces of legislation in the UK in recent history, again, in my opinion, is the Equalities Act 2010, which aims to reduce socio-economic inequalities, harmonize equality law relating to discrimination and harassment related to certain personal characteristics, and to prohibit victimization, as well as to increase equality of opportunity, and to amend the law relating to rights and responsibilities in family relations. Communities that are only considered useful when they're producing labor is no basis for an equitable society. An example of this is the Windrush scandal of 2017, and maybe with the time I'll move on from that. Next slide. Health outcomes, as Anaya has already said, are markedly less equal for NHS services in all measured outcomes. The Restorative Justice All-Party Parliamentary Group's investigation of 2021 on the current implementation and impact of restorative practices in non-judicial settings across the UK found that within health, restorative practices was found to be of significant value in a range of settings, and that the potential benefits could be considerable. It also found that the current implementation was varied, muddled, and local. Changing mindsets was considered a significant obstacle, with the attitudes, policies, and practices of professional bodies, alongside a legacy of risk averseness and blame-focused culture. Participants felt that the processes could be more restorative and aligned to a just culture. Next slide, please. The built environment is where we live. It is paramount, therefore, that we look at restorative practices in and for built environment professions. I would recommend the acceptance speech for DA, winners of the recent Venice Architectural Biennale Golden Lion for best participation. But I'm particularly interested in expanding the capacity of public policy within a specific emphasis on the built environment and its impact on communities within and beyond cities. By breaking outdated binaries such as urban and rural, we can more effectively address global challenges that are acutely felt at a local level, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, landscape, elderly care, and housing, and create restorative practices designed to mend what is broken. According to Celia Pym, a British artist working with textiles, mending is tactile work and action specific to the damage of the body and physical being. As architects and built environment professionals, we need to start thinking in this way by understanding the relationship between the built environment, our bodies, and the physical beings of all life and non-life on Earth. This relationship is exemplified by the tragic case of Ella Kisu Deborah, whose picture you see here, whose death from acute respiratory failure in 2013 sparked a public inquiry that drew a causal relationship between her asthma attacks and the high incidence of air pollution around her home, a legal first. Ella's mother, Rosemond, has advocated for a new Clean Air Act and for governments everywhere to take this matter seriously. Her case has been instrumental in the Mayor Sadiq Khan's implementing and expanding London's low emission zones. Demonstrating restorative practices through direct action, Rosemont is driven not by retribution, but a desire to prevent future deaths through public education into the universal yet inequitable impact of air pollution. Last slide, please. As an architect from a global majority background, engaged in equitable, inclusive, and restorative practices, I always ask, what is the Black perspective and what is unique about the Black experience, especially in the UK context? For me, equitable and socially just policies for the built environment and beyond lie at the intersection of race and place. We need to replace our short-term reactive approaches with long-term proactive, healing, restorative approaches. This is important not because they benefit minorities or even global majorities, but because restorative practices benefit us all, from the air we all breathe, through the communities we all form part of, to the world we all inhabit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicity. I'm aware that you had to speed through that to get through in time, so we really do appreciate it. We might have time for 2 questions if we answer as quickly as we possibly can. I can see, Nai, you're answering some questions in the chat for us. So I'm going to bring the first one to you, Nai, so that Felicity has a bit of a breather. Firstly, fantastic presentations. That's what we're getting through in the chat. Somebody is typing in, they love the inclusion of colonial matrix of power because it alludes to the embedded elements of coloniality and its self-regulating and reinforcing systems that needs to change. They're curious if you've encountered any emerging AI systems that have explored decoloniality in their design.
Thank you, Kimberly, for the fantastic question. I really appreciate it. In terms of exploring emerging AI systems that have really used decoloniality in their design, there are a lot of people looking at this. So one of the networks I'm a part of is called Terra Commune, and it's kind of it's a global network of people interested in doing that very thing. And so really thinking about how can we imagine and pursue and do work around exploring decoloniality through digital transformation and AI. And there's some really great people who do just that. And so I can think of a lot of really great work coming out of Latin America, which I'm aware of, and that you can learn more about on the site. But I'd say, number one, getting connected to the data justice community can be a really, really good start to learn more about that work. And I think that we all, as a community of scholars and people in the world, can do more to amplify it. And so thank you for your great question.
Thank you for the very kind of condensed answer as well, Nai. That was brilliant. I'm going to bring a question to Felicity before we wrap up as well. Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. We're getting lots of this through. Could you recommend any organisations that are doing some brilliant work or good work in the area of long-term healing restorative practices within the built environment?
I would say the DAR, who I mentioned, DAAR, who are a practice working really in Palestine, but also not here, basically, but in that room that they were in at the Venice Biennale, the main focus was about restorative practices, physical restorative practices. Unfortunately, there isn't much in terms of where my interest is in terms of talking practices, but I think that's what I'm hoping, that this talk starts to generate a critical mass that can go forward with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't think we have time for any more questions, I'm afraid, because we have to wrap up. I'd like to really take this opportunity to thank everyone who's been part of putting this together, the comms team who are working really hard behind the scenes, but a special thank you to Felicity and Nye, who we have met on several occasions to make this happen, and for sharing your invaluable insights and expertise. It really is appreciated. And I really hope for everyone who's joined us that these conversations can continue to move forward and it doesn't end at the end of this session. So thank you once again for being part of this dialogue, and really stay safe wherever you may be joining us from the world today. Thank you and goodbye.